Blue Marble Defenders story number 32, Everyday ETs. Chapter 1, Helen's Hello. Greetings, Helen Larkspur here. Some of you might know me only from my baseball broadcasts on WZMR radio, but others may know I'm also a syndicated sports reporter. I most often write about team managers' strategies, such as why they trade players, bring players up from the minor leagues, decide a batting order, decide when a player should bunt or go for a hit and run. This article is different. It's about extraterrestrials. Why, you may ask? Well, one day I interviewed the young Red Sox second baseman and learned that when he wasn't playing baseball, he helped defend our planet from dangerous ETs. Over a bag of Space Spuds potato chips, I asked him if ETs were always dangerous, and he told me about one helpful ET that had turned himself into a fantastic baseball bat. That got my attention, and after I left him, I read a couple of books about the Blue Marble Defenders, the small group he belongs to that deals with extraterrestrials and environmental polluters. The next time I encountered the guy, he goes by the name of Rookie, by the way, I asked him if he had any more unreported stories about nice ETs he'd met. He recounted one, and when I pressed him for more, he introduced me to his brother Leo and his friend Tess, who shared tales with me. So today I won't report the gory details of how the Red Sox snookered the Yankees on a player trade as I'd planned. Instead, I'll share 3 little stories that might change the way you think about ETs. Okay, let's get started. Chapter 2, Rookie Recovers. I recorded my interview with Rookie, and here's what the up-and-coming baseball star said in his exact words.
So here's my little story. I was living in China at the time because I'd had the good fortune of being invited to teach the game of baseball to a newly formed Little League in Beijing. They paid me just enough to feed myself, but they let me use an apartment. It was small, but I liked it. And they arranged for Chinese language classes so I'd be able to converse on simple topics. One day early in my stay, when I hadn't yet made any friends, I was walking through the streets of my neighborhood and saw several dogs playing in a storefront window. A couple of cats were visible in the background, so I figured it might be a pet shop or maybe the Chinese equivalent of an SPCA, the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals that takes in unwanted animals and helps them find new homes. I walked in, and I'll tell you, when a lonely guy in a foreign country walks through a bunch of friendly dogs, his mood changes, and it's for the better. I was enjoying all the canine adulation when a smiling lady came from the back room. She nodded and said, "Ni hao." I replied, "Ni hao," hello, in Chinese. And in my broken Chinese, I tried to convey that I was just window shopping. I was pleased when she said, "Oh, how wonderful, a Westerner. Please allow me to practice my English with you." Of course, I agreed, and she said, "You're most welcome to get to know our friendly and available puppies here, but you might also be interested in an unusual dog over there." I nodded. I followed, and she pointed with an open-handed gesture to a cage along a side wall. I could see what appeared to be a small dog. I figured it was maybe 40 to 50 centimeters in height and 60 centimeters long, but I couldn't be sure because it was rolled up in a ball sleeping. The lady gently tapped the cage. When the sleeping animal woke and stretched, I was surprised to see that it had no fur, but what appeared more like skin. It was somewhat like a human skin, but sturdier and more leather-like on its legs, and more like a brown satin fabric on its face and body. When it stood and faced us, I saw a tail or something, I don't know, like an elephant's trunk, where I'd expected a wet doggy nose. I gotta say, the sight was jarring. The lady probably noticed me tense up and said, "I'm afraid I can't tell you what breed it is. It arrived after my veterinarian friend left town for vacation, but I believe it's a female. I'm sure you agree she is a unique and quite interesting animal." Well, I agreed and stooped down to look more closely. At first, I couldn't keep from fixating on the trunk or the tail or whatever it was. But as I moved my head closer to the dog's, if it was a dog, that is, I was more captivated by her expressive and gentle eyes. Her lashes were long, and they curled upward and downward as though she'd been prepped to be in a TV cosmetics commercial. She cocked her head and then moved it around as though studying me, and when her eyes met mine, they seemed to smile. When I stood, the dog stood on her hind legs, placed her forepaws on the cage floor, and stared up at me. My first thought was, "You're so strange on the outside, but I just bet you're wonderful inside." Then I said to myself, "So what does strange mean?" And I decided the word just refers to something that's outside normal experience, not necessarily bad or good, just different. And I'm certainly never going to reject an animal or a person just because they have an unusual appearance. The lady said, "Her name is Mofa. If you would like to take her home and see how you two get along, that would be all right for me." I replied, "Well, that's kind of you, but I'll be staying in Beijing only 1 month, and I wouldn't be able to take her back to my parents' house. We often go away when my mother or father have to have work assignments." The lady looked at me for a moment and seemed to be evaluating whether I treat the animal kindly, and she replied, "I believe the two of you have a special connection and would get along together. I would be happy if you took her with you now and brought her back to me before you leave. Earlier would also be all right if you don't get along as well as I expect you will." I gotta say, the idea of having a companion for the next month was appealing, and I agreed. The lady had me fill out a bunch of paperwork, placed a collar around Mofa's neck, and attached a leash. Excited and happy, the two of us walked out the door. When I turned to look back, the lady was standing in the doorway smiling. I nodded and said, "Xie xie." It means thank you in Chinese. My apartment was on the 25th floor of a 40-story building, less than 10 minutes from the shop. Mofa turned more than a few heads on our trip. I guess people were staring, really. But walking with her was easy. She seemed to know the best way to cross at intersections and stopped and looked up as we approached my building. I said, "Mofa, you're aptly named, but I'm going to take the liberty of anglicizing it. From now on, we speak together, you and I, in English, and your name is Magic." I showed Magic my apartment. I improvised a bed with some towels, and we walked together to a store where I purchased food for her. We also stopped at a small restaurant to get food for me. The restaurant's glass window listed its specialties of beef, pork chops, and sausages. The photos were appealing, and remarkably, a small sticker on the restaurant's door said all its food was made from peas, beans, and other plants. Arriving back, I fed Magic, and she ate hungrily, using her trunk to feed herself as an elephant does. My dinner was hard to distinguish from a real beefsteak, and I told myself I'd go back to that restaurant every second day for the same treat. I walked Magic after dinner and again the next morning before I left for the baseball field. Magic and I got to know each other, and I grew fond of her. I studied her trunk and found out it wasn't a trunk like an elephant's. It had no passageway for liquid, and she drank water with her long tongue. She didn't seem to use the drone for anything, and I thought it must help her balance, just like animals' tails do. I just thought of Magic as a dog with two tails. Magic slept all day in the apartments. We continued a similar daily routine the following days, and I did feel the special connection the lady had foreseen, especially when I arrived back at the end of the afternoon and she jumped up and welcomed me. Teaching hitting, fielding, and base running was the best work I ever had, and I learned a lot of Chinese along the way. The kids were appreciative and they learned fast. The coaches of the dozen teams in the league, well, they were respectful. They asked me all kinds of questions, and all went well. All went well for me until 3 days before I was to leave China. Returning to the apartment, I greeted Magic. We played for a minute as usual and went straight to my laptop to record observations I made that day about some players' weaknesses and how I'd suggest they improve. But the second I opened the laptop, I was struck by large, bold letters in an ugly font that said, "Tough luck, sucker. Now we own your data and we own your whole PC. Pay up and you go back to normal. But do it now or you're toast. $1,000 in Bitcoin, please." Holy cow, I'd been hacked. My laptop and all my data were being held for ransom. Stress filled me. It filled the whole apartment. I hit the return key, hoping this would all just go away like a bad joke. Yeah, right. The screen blinked violently and it changed colors every 2 seconds. I pulled up my phone and called Pops in the US, but he didn't answer. I called Leo in France and then Uncle Americo, but they didn't answer either. Then the laptop made a whining noise. The noise rose to a screech, and it flashed a message. "Time's up, bozo. Open your browser now and commence payment, or your computer and data will be fried." Oh, you can imagine. I howled. I covered my head with my hands and took deep breaths to get myself under control. My masterpiece, with a whole month of observations and advice for each coach and player, it could be gone. All the data I had collected, all the progress reports I'd written, all the advice I'd crafted for coaches when they ran tryouts next season, all gone. I was despondent, but that oscillating, high-pitched whine from the laptop seemed to be determined to drive me crazy. I was too frazzled to even cry. Magic walked over to where I was sitting and rubbed my leg. I kneaded her back with one hand while I held my head in the other. She put her second tail on my lap. When I looked down, she jumped up on me, something she'd never done without being invited. She placed her front paws on the table and closed the laptop. At first I was startled, but within a millisecond I was furious. Closing the lid may have taken away my option of paying. I didn't have the money to pay, but I hadn't resigned myself to defeat. I screamed, "Magic!" and grabbed her shoulders in both hands. She didn't react to me. She encircled the laptop with her, her, her second tail, raising it like 10 centimeters above the table. The whole laptop then glowed in a blue light. It gave off a low-pitched hum that vibrated my hands and even the chair I sat on. I couldn't figure out the source of the light. I bent around Magic's neck and saw her left canine tooth glowing intensely. Alternatively, dark blue and white light. The tooth was vibrating. I looked on her right side. That canine was glowing too. After 30 seconds, she dropped the laptop back on the table with a small thud. I released my grip on her shoulders. She jumped to the floor, rubbed my leg with her flank, and walked slowly toward her bed. Huh, weird. I straightened the laptop and opened it. The screen was black. I thought, oh, no, everything's fried. I sat for a few seconds, took 2 deep breaths, and finally concluded there was no sense crying over spilled milk, and I stood up. Then, without a thought in my head, I reached down and pressed the laptop's on-off switch. The screen lit up. The system booted, and familiar words appeared on the screen. Hello, rookie.
Chapter 3, Tessa's Tale. Hi again, folks. I hope you enjoyed Rookie's little vignette, and I trust you'll find this next one as interesting. As with Rookie's story, I relied on the recording of my interview to bring you this one in Tessa's exact words.
I was living in Florida with my uncle while studying physics and astronomy at the university in Fort Myers. It was spring break, and I was sunning myself on a busy beach on Sanibel Island. I had just stood up to go into the water when I heard a commotion up the beach. I watched a few seconds and realized the sound was cheering. Cheering. Later, I could see people on their feet. They were running around, tapping the ball high into the air. They tapped the ball around in a rough circle for a while, and then they eventually lost interest, and the ball floated in my direction, tapped into the air occasionally by others. The ball then changed directions and headed back where it had been. Curiously, it seemed to do that without being struck by anybody. At times, it dropped onto the sand and bounded high into the air without anybody tapping it. It appeared to have a mind of its own. When it bounced back in my direction, I thought I heard sounds coming from it. It came straight at me and I tried to catch it, but it zoomed away and down toward a deserted part of the beach. Chasing after it, I was totally confused about how or why it was moving so fast on a day when no wind was blowing. Well, I became convinced the beach ball was actually giving out sounds. And when no people were around, I realized it was the sound of giggling or chuckling or laughing. Most of the time, the ball moved along just above the level of my raised arms. It was fast, and I thought I was about to lose it. But it turned and zoomed right at me. It didn't bounce. It moved like a tiny airplane or a drone. It darted quickly, here and there. I jumped, and I grabbed it. I brought it down, and when I sat on the sand holding it, the giggling stopped. I studied the ball, trying to understand how it worked, but it wiggled energetically, and I couldn't hold it still. And the giggling came back. The ball tried to bounce itself out of my grasp, but I held it tight. It became ever more animated, and I finally had to hold it down on the sand with my belly. The ball didn't feel like it was made from normal plastic, at least not from any plastic I'd ever encountered. It was pliable, flexible, and soft. It was a uniform light blue color, kind of a Florida blue sky color. I turned the ball all around but found no seams. I started to think it wasn't a ball, but rather, perhaps, a being, something alive. Really? I asked myself. A living beach ball? It continued to make giggling noises, although I couldn't tell where they originated. I felt, I felt a bit goofy about doing it. But I tried tickling the ball with my fingers. It whooped and laughed, and I said, "Why are you so darn happy?" Hey, get this, everybody. It answered me. It answered me in English. And it said, "This planet has lots of oxygen. Very dense, very dense, very happy, very happy." Believe me, I was blown away. And I asked, "Oh, where are you from?" But it didn't answer. I asked, "How did you get here?" Still, no answer. "What is your name?" No answer. I tried again to find a mouth or something on the ball, but found nothing. I tickled it again and heard a giggle. I turned the ball around. I still couldn't find where the giggling could come from. And I said, I'll keep tickling you until you show me your mouth. But it kept silent. I asked myself, where are its eyes? Then I realized that maybe, just maybe, the whole ball was one big eye. I was confused but excited, and I decided to take the ball back to Uncle Jim's. He was a top scientist, and while he wasn't an expert in extraterrestrials like Leo and Rookie's father, he knew some stuff. Being careful not to let it escape, I picked up my beach towel and walked to my car. Concerned it might bounce around in the car while I was driving, I covered it with my beach towel and tucked the towel into the seat cushion. Since it was the middle of the afternoon, most people visiting Sanibel stayed on the beach and traffic was light until I drove onto the highway and joined lots of trucks playing stop and go. Then I heard car horns blasting somewhere behind me. Looking in the rearview mirror, I saw a car weave between lanes and then speed toward me in the breakdown lane. It zoomed past on the passenger side, and I thought, stay away from me, buddy. A second later, the car in front of the truck in front of me turned into the breakdown lane to make its way onto an exit ramp. The speeder crashed into the side of the car, and the truck crashed into them both. I was lucky to be able to steer away and stop, and even luckier that the car behind didn't bash into me. As tires screeched all around me, the beach ball freed itself. It bounced off the rear window. It hit the windscreen. It bounced against my shoulder onto the passenger seat's floor and then onto the passenger seat itself. Brakes continued to screech intermittently behind me for a few seconds, so I sat with my head tight against the seat's headrest just in case an impact arrived from behind. The tangled metal ahead, whoa, it told me somebody's life could be in danger, so I jumped out of the car to see if I could help. Before I could slam the door, the beach ball bounded against the window. I nudged it back so I could close the door without hurting it. I stopped when I heard, I come, I help. With all that was going on, the fact that this ball could talk didn't surprise me. My brain only worried about the hassle of trying to help an accident victim while holding a beach ball. So I gently moved the door toward the latch. Then I heard, please, I help, I could. Frazzled by that accident, maybe even traumatized. I didn't want to be thinking about little stuff like whether to take a ball with me. I didn't want to be thinking at all. I wanted to be running to help. I just grabbed the thing and took off toward the tangled steel mess ahead. That scene was shocking. When I rounded the back of the truck, I almost tripped on a person's leg under a dented car door on the pavement. I looked up to call for help, but realized I was the first person on the scene. Pushing aside the mangled door with one arm while holding the beach ball in the other, I saw an unconscious man with blood trickling from a wounded arm. That didn't really look life-threatening, but boy, it needed skilled medical attention. One of his legs was lying at an unnatural angle, so I was afraid it was broken. With all the wreckage around him, I guess he might have internal injuries too. I was desperate to help, but I had no idea what to do. As I tried to get my thoughts together, the beach ball jumped from my arm and landed on the man's chest. I reached to grab it again, but stopped in surprise when it gave out a loud sound. Nya, nya, nya. The ball remained on the man's chest, but was deflating rapidly. I was frozen, and all I could do was watch. The sound stopped when the ball was almost completely deflated. I picked up what was left, stood, and looked around. The sound of sirens came from the distance. Through some trees, I could see an ambulance screaming up the highway exit. It stopped only about 20 meters ahead, and two medics jumped out and raced toward me. I backed up a few steps, holding the deflated ball to give them room, and then I noticed that the man's bleeding had stopped, and he was regaining consciousness. He shook both arms. The bleeding one seemed as good as the other. He moved his legs, and the one I was afraid was broken moved perfectly well. In the few seconds it took for the medic to arrive, the man sat up. "Are you okay, sir?" The medic called to him. Yeah, I'm fine. I'm okay. I'm better than fine. I'm better than any right I have to be fine, given this mishmash of steel I'm sitting in. Get on over to that crazy driver's car. I'm sure you can do more good for him," the guy said. The medic hopped over a broken piece of car bumper and dashed out of sight. I asked the man if I could get him some water or anything. He thanked me and said he was just fine. Then I walked back to my car when a second medic approached. I laid the deflated beach ball in the back of the seat and said, "You, my friend, you have some special powers. Well done. You'll have to tell me about them when I get to Uncle Jim's." He gave no response, worrying me that the ball had exhausted itself and perhaps even had died saving that man. I had to sit in the car for only a few minutes. The left lane of traffic opened quickly. I pulled out and arrived at Uncle Jim's about 20 minutes later, driving, I'll tell you, more slowly and far more carefully than ever. I got out of the car and opened the door to the back seat with great trepidation. But I saw the beach ball about 90% inflated. I tickled it, and it giggled.
Chapter 4, Leo's Lessons. Okay, folks, on to the next story. Here's what Leo told me in his own words.
Sure, Helen. Glad to tell you this story, and you can publish it if you want. It started when I was itching to do a winter hike in Glacier National Park with my buddy from Montana. But at the last minute, he couldn't make it. Hey, I was wired for a big hike, so I quickly cooked up a plan with a friend in Colorado to trek between 10th Mountain Division backcountry huts in the Rockies. But then more trouble arrived, and my flight to Denver was late. When I arrived at the airport, I phoned and told my friend to go ahead of me and said I'd follow later on my snowshoes. He said he'd climb up to the hut with skins on his skis, drop his food and sleeping bag, and climb higher and ski down through the untouched snow that had fallen overnight and was still falling. I said if I made it to the hut by mid-afternoon, I'd follow up his tracks and watch him ski down. When I arrived at the trailhead, the fresh snow had covered my friend's tracks, but a trail entrance was nicely framed right there, tall Douglas fir trees right around it, and I set out at a fast pace. I made good progress through the forest and up steep terrain. Then the trail forked. I looked at my map, but it didn't show a split, so I chose the branch that looked widest and in the right direction. About 2 hours into the expected 3-hour ascent, I took a break and munched on a peanut butter sandwich. I noticed a dead tree just a few meters into the woods to my left. It was broken off about 4 meters above the ground, and it was riddled with woodpecker holes. It was such an interesting tree. So interesting I could imagine an artist standing behind his easel where I was and painting it. Then I noticed something move. It moved in the shadow of the largest hole. Nothing happened for a few seconds, so I took a couple of steps toward it. Then two eyes looked out. I heard rustling sounds and then saw another pair of eyes from a smaller hole. Another and another followed. It was kind of scary actually, and I backed away while keeping my eyes on the tree, almost tripping on a branch hidden under the snow. I figured the occupants of the tree must be birds or some small rodents, but it kind of nagged at me that the eyes were far too big. I stood on the trail, watched for a while, and then decided I had no time to waste if I wanted to make it to the hut in time to watch my buddies ski the mountain from above the hut. I'd taken just 2 steps when I heard a flurry of activity and turned back toward the tree. A dozen giant sausages were flying out of the tree. They were zinging through the air straight at me. Can you imagine? I was scared to death. These things were about half a meter long and about 10 centimeters in diameter. They must have squeezed into the woodpecker holes because they made a pop when they squeezed out. Now they'd formed up and came at me in the V-shaped flight formation of migrating geese. I pulled off my backpack, bent close to the ground, and held the pack in front of my face. But they simply flew silently over my head as though they were Blue Angel jets in a slow motion flyby. I turned to see where they'd gone. All but one were in a cluster less than 10 meters away and 2 meters high up off the ground. The remaining one, well, it was slowly moving toward me, toward my face. I grasped my ski poles, grasped them tight in case I needed them to defend myself. The sausage moved back a few centimeters. It kind of gave me a feeling that it had read my emotions and didn't want to appear threatening. The sausage then resumed its advance toward me, very slowly this time. It stopped about 2 meters away. It was shiny and medium brown, had no extremities, ears, nose, or mouth, only eyes with large whites and jet black pupils. It seemed to hover effortlessly like a long balloon. We stared at each other. It didn't move. It didn't seem to have the desire or ability to hurt me. But in this unimaginable situation, I sure wasn't certain of that. I couldn't stand there all afternoon, so I put my backpack on and resumed walking up the trail. Fortunately, I didn't need to walk straight near the sausage or the sausage cluster behind it. I went on without looking back for about 10 steps. Then I turned my head to check out what was happening. I saw the one sausage just slightly behind me and about a meter to my side. The sausage pack was about 5 meters behind me. Continuing up the snowy path, I glanced around occasionally and noted they'd remained in the same relative position. While walking, I amused myself. Hey, come on, I had to think of something. My brain was going around. And I thought, hey, they didn't pay for a reservation to sleep at the hut, so I don't have to worry about them following me in. The sausage stayed to my left as I continued, but it moved just slightly ahead of me. A few minutes later, a couple of other sausages zoomed ahead to the right. Those two demonstrated they were quite pliable by gracefully zooming along like dolphins swimming. Now, rather than making me feel threatened, these sausages made me feel like I had warm, friendly companions. The trail became steeper, and I thought I must be near the hut when the trail entered a small clearing with a sharp cliff on its far side. I checked the perimeter of the clearing, but found no sign of the trail continuing. I walked to the cliff's edge, looked down, no hut there. I looked across the deep ravine below. Well, I was momentarily pleased when I spied the hut, but then it registered that it was on a distant hillside. Yow! What a mess I was in! I pulled out the map but could make no sense of it. Then I noticed in fine print at the bottom right corner said, "Abandoned logging roads are not shown on this map." Ugh! I'd been wrong to enter the first trail I saw way back in the parking lot. I was on a logging road, not the path to the hut. What the heck could I do? If I retrace my steps and find the right trail entrance, I can't make it up to the hut before dark. If I could safely make my way down the cliff, I might encounter a stream and dangerously thin ice. If I made it across the stream, I could still miss the hut or get stuck or hurt myself in a place where no rescuer would ever look. Well, then a strange thing happened. A strange, but a happy thing, that is. The sausages must have sensed both my consternation and my objective. The lead sausage gently flew itself under my right hand, raising it and the ski pole it held up to my shoulder. This was weird. I just stared, wondering what was coming next. Well, another sausage did the same to my left hand, and shortly after, both of them let my hands down. They moved themselves to my underarms. Felt kind of weird. They pressed tight under my pits, and they raised my whole body a centimeter or two, and then put me down. I got the idea. After thinking about it. I knew what they were doing, and I got the idea what they wanted to do. But man, oh man, what a decision to make. Trust my life to a bunch of ET sausages? How would I ever explain that decision to mom and pops? The two under my arms lifted me again higher this time, and two other sausages inserted themselves under my snowshoes, and the four of them raised me a meter up. They hovered for a while, and then four more pressed themselves against my back, two sides, and gut. And after pausing, they raised me yet another meter. There I was, 2 meters in the air, just hovering. Then two more inserted themselves under the ones under my armpits, and one of the remaining two hovered about a meter on my left. The final one came about 50 centimeters in front of my face and did a little jig in the air. It stopped, and it stared at me. It looked like he was, like it was, asking me a question in some kind of sign language. Actually, I knew what the question was. And I thought, well, this does feel like it will work. I looked at the sausage and I nodded. This last sausage took up position on my right hand, and working in harmony, the sausages slowly moved me closer and closer to the cliff. Before reaching the precipice, they floated me higher until I was just above the crown of a fir tree, where they had a clear sight line to the hut. They all hovered in place till I got it, until I got there. They wanted me to give the go-ahead, I guess. I turned my head, looked to the right, locked eyes with the sausage that was acting as the guide. Decision time. I nodded, and they moved me slowly and directly out over the cliff, above the ravine, and toward the hut. Perhaps you can imagine the turbulence rocking my mind. I had just locked eyes with a sausage. Yes, a flying sausage. Nobody knew where I was or what I was doing. Nobody could ever imagine doing it. And I had given the okay to be transported hundreds of meters above the ground toward a mountain hut I'd never visited. Well, fortunately, we moved slowly, so there was no wind whistling in my ears, and no gusts came up to destabilize me. It was a remarkably easy trip, until, that is, we were about 2/3 of the way across the ravine. I heard a loud crack. It reverberated off the nearby mountains. I looked out and around and saw nothing, but felt intense vibrating waves in the air. My upper body then lurched to the left and tilted horizontal. Was I going down? Had I misjudged these sausages' ability to secure me? Fortunately, my even-keeled sausages righted me before I became truly scared, and as I returned fully upright, a huge puff of powder jetted up from the base of the snow-covered peak above the hut. It had been an avalanche, a massive one. The sausages must have sensed my anxiety, because they propelled me faster toward the hut. As we neared, I yelled for my buddy, but no response came back. I spotted a single set of ski and pole tracks going up the mountain. I looked to my sausage guide on the right, pointed to the tracks, waved my finger to follow them toward the mountaintop, and the guide got the message. We stayed over the tracks, now moving even faster. The tracks ended in huge piles of snow, ice, and debris. careful not to dislodge the sausages under my armpits. I raised my hands palm up and twisted my head back and forth, trying to signal the need to search for my buddy. But none of them searched. My sausage guide shot like an arrow toward a point halfway up the mountain to our right. The others carried me behind him, but when we arrived, I couldn't see the guide, only a small hole in the erratic blocks of snow and ice. My friendly sausages lowered me to the ground. The guide's behavior told me he knew my buddy's exact location. I pulled my avalanche probe from the pack and assembled it. The probe is a 4-meter long, narrow steel tube you assemble from 4 sections. I stabbed it into the snow in many places, but never met with the resistance a person's body would give. I did it all over. I was exasperated. I didn't know what to do. But all I could do was follow the hole from my guide. I removed my snowshoes and used them as shovels, following the sausage's hole the best I could. 3 other sausages now bored into the snow and ice a few meters above me. I was hoping their tunnels would provide air holes for my buddy to breathe if they did find him. If his body hadn't been crushed by the avalanche, maybe we had a chance to save him. I dug furiously, but I fretted occasionally about not seeing any of the sausages re-emerge. Had they died trying to save him? I was now up to my waist in a snow hole. I lost track of the first sausage's burrow hole, and I could only hope I was digging in the right direction. Digging, furiously digging. My friend was almost, I don't know. Finally, I hit something hard. I scratched away snow with my hands and discovered a boot. My friend was almost perfectly upside down. That explained why I missed him with a probe. I doubled my pace. I dug like a madman, even though my shoulders and arms were burning. I reached about the level of my friend's knee when I heard, all right, stop raining snow into my face. The sausages had burrowed out a cavern around his upside-down body. That relieved the pressure on his torso, and it brought him air to breathe. It took me more than an hour of careful digging and actually comic chatter with my buddy to fully free him from the snow and pull him out. His skis and poles were long gone, but he was able to follow in my snowshoe tracks back to the cabin. You know, I never saw the sausages again. I don't know how I would have done it, but I wanted to thank them, and so did my buddy. We thought they might have returned to that hollow tree they'd adopted as a home, and we vowed to hike back to it at our very next opportunity. And we made 2 more vows. 1, never go into the wilderness alone. And 2, give ETs a chance to prove whether they're good or dangerous.
Chapter 5, Larkspur's Last Word. Well, folks, I hope you enjoyed these 3 little stories. Those of you who've read books about the Blue Marble Defender's exploits may have thought all extraterrestrials were dangerous. So I hope you now realize that at least some are just as helpful and kind as normal human beings. I do have one wish about ETs. I wish more of them had an interest in baseball. That's my sport. Can you imagine if America's Baseball World Series was just one of many elimination rounds, and end-of-season baseball went on to a solar system series, followed by a Milky Way galactic series, and ending with the Universal Series? Since many great new players would surely emerge from the solar system and galaxies, do you think Mookie Betts or Mickey Mantle or Ted Williams or Babe Ruth would still be your favorite? Whatever your favorite team or player, follow my advice and choose Space Spuds potato chips as your food of thought until we meet again.